y'all doing? Sure? Who told you that? Oh, you'll be fine. You'll be fine. We didn't get as much snow as the city got. What I'm saying, but we didn't get that much snow.
Good evening, everyone. Come on in. It's great to see everybody. Join us this evening. We are really glad that you're here. If it gets too cold, you can snuggle up to your neighbor. If your neighbor doesn't appreciate that, why, you just don't do it then. It's great to see you all tonight. Thanks for being here. Thanks for being a part of the evening. Glad to see everybody out and about. Glad to see that you survived Snowmageddon yesterday. It was really amazing. It was beautiful watching it fall. It was just really fantastic. And I went walking yesterday morning while it was still falling, and that was a treat. And so Carson, who generally does not go walking with me ever, wanted to go walking with me yesterday, and so he went walking with me yesterday. And I'm sure if the neighbors were looking out the window, they're thinking, "What has this kid done?" Because here's his dad, hustling him along in the, I guess trying to lose him, because I kept checking back over my shoulder. Are you still with me? Yeah, I'm with you. And then you say, you give the instructions. Now look, don't get in people's yards. They may not want the snow messed up, right? You can mess up the snow in our yard. Don't touch anybody else's snow, right? It was beautiful. But when snow falls, it is just so peaceful, man. Even peaceful in a city like Houston. Isn't that amazing? It was just fantastic when that was coming down. So it was beautiful, and hope that you enjoyed it. Hope you enjoyed the time. And then it's gone, and it's all gone. And that's the way it works. That's some people's favorite snowfall. Come, it's beautiful. Take your pictures, do your thing, and then go away. And that's how most folks like it. It was really beautiful. Thankful that we had the chance to see it. Glad that you're here. When we arrived in Houston in the dead of summer, which would be a great drought and a horrible heat, but that's every summer. And so Paul twos, we're unloading our belongings, and I have all the garden equipment and all the garden tools that I'm unloading from the truck, and I have a snow shovel. And Paul twos just loses his mind laughing that I've brought my snow shovel. And like, well, who's laughing now, Paul? Right? There we have. I thought about bringing it Sunday to show you, but I'll just tell you about it. We're glad that you're here. Glad that we have the time to share together. So we're in the book of Acts, and we're in this passage where Paul is on his way and in the midst of prison. He's in prison. He's being transferred from Jerusalem to Caesarea. Eventually will wind up in Rome. We find him here along about Acts 24 and 25. We're getting into Acts 25. We started there last Wednesday evening, and we took just a little bit of a time to think about some of the events that are unfolding between Paul's time in Acts 24 and the time that's recorded in Acts 25. In Acts 24, we meet Paul dealing with and engaging Felix, and then in Acts 25, we'll find him dealing with and engaging Festus. We know that Felix was the governor, if you will. He was the overseer in the territory where Paul was being held. He's the one that Paul initially intervenes with and has his trial before. There was a great conflict, just sort of the backstory of Felix and his place in Acts 24 and Acts 25. There was a great conflict between the Jews and the Gentiles, which erupted in Caesarea during the time when Felix was in charge. Felix responded with an absolute brutal showing of force against the Jews, and it left a tremendous amount of animosity. Now remember, Felix is there representing the government of Rome. Rome typically would go into an area and pretty well leave the area intact in so much as the local authorities were concerned, in so much as the local governing structure was concerned, but they made no mistake or apologies about it. They were in charge, but they left the region or the territory, if you will, intact in so much as their local governance was concerned. It was more or less absorbed as part of Rome now. And so the problem came out of this in terms of Felix's response to this uprising or this outcry of division. Felix was so violent and he was so over the top that it really caused Rome to think what kind of trouble they would have in the future should the Jews have any type of revolt or uprising against Rome at some other point in time, if they became the target, if you will. It's not that Rome was afraid of them. Rome, listen, a small fire is one thing to deal with, but when you've got small fires burning everywhere, that becomes a problem for a superpower. And Rome was a superpower, and the fewer small fires they had to deal with, the better. He was recalled to Rome to face charges in about AD 60. He was replaced by Festus, and he would face accusations from the Jews, and that's why Paul was left in jail. That's why he was left in prison, so that Felix could be at least seen as doing a favor to the Jews. Now, when Festus comes into the scene, he rules only 2 years. He dies while he's in office. He was not a perfect leader, but he was better. He was a better ruler than Felix, and much better than the one who would follow him. So he was trying to calm down all the difficulties that are going on here with the Jews. Festus was probably the right guy at this point in time. He was as big of a peacemaker as you could probably find in this region and in this segment of Paul's journey. And he's in the right place in the right time for the right reason. And we spoke about these things last week, and I'm not going to spend all the time as we get into them, but just to bring us back up to where we were. Festus then arrives in the province. 3 days later, he goes to Jerusalem from Caesarea. The chief priests, the leading men of the Jews, brought charges against Paul. They were urging him, requesting a concession against Paul, that he might have him brought to Jerusalem at the same time, setting an ambush to kill him on the way. So there is this prompting on the part of those who have brought the accusations against Paul. There's a prompting on their part to Festus, let's transfer him. Well, Festus has this in the back of his mind. I'm not certain, and there's nothing in the text that indicates Festus is wise to the ambush that's set up, so he doesn't seem to be aware that this is part of the back scene going on, that these individuals are asking for Paul to be transferred because they've set up an ambush for him. Festus is sort of just, if you will, if you'll pardon the expression, he's a useful idiot in the process of their nefarious plan. They want Festus to transfer him so that they can have another ambush or another go at ambushing Paul. Festus then answered that Paul was being kept in custody at Caesarea and that he himself was about to leave shortly. Therefore he said, let the influential men among you go there with me, and if there's anything wrong about the man, let them prosecute him. So Festus says, just come with me, we'll go interview him, and if there's something wrong, we'll have the trial while we were there. After he had spent not more than 8 or 10 days among them, he went down to Caesarea, and on the next day took his seat on the tribunal and ordered Paul to be brought. After Paul arrived, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him, bringing many and serious charges against him, which they could not prove, while Paul said in his own defense, I've committed no offense, either against the law of the Jews or against the temple or against Caesar. But Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, remember, he's there to curry favor with the Jews, and I'm not convinced that he knows about this plot, answered Paul and said, are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and stand trial before me on these charges? How about we change venues? That's what he offers. Can we change the venue? Well, remember the ambush. There's an ambush lying in wait. It's exactly what they want. They want Paul to be transferred. It's easier to ambush him in that route of a transfer than at any other point in time. And so this is open to Paul. Now, Paul avails himself of his rights, and he avails himself, if you will, of the due process that's afforded to him as a Roman citizen. Paul said, I am standing before Caesar's tribunal where I ought to be tried. I've done no wrong to the Jews, as you also very well know. If then I am a wrongdoer and have committed anything worthy of death, I do not refuse to die. But if none of those things is true of which these men accuse me, no one can hand me over to them. Paul says this, if I've committed a crime that's worthy of death, then punish me, prosecute me, and execute me. Paul submits himself to the government. Paul also avails himself within the setting of the government to say, I know my rights as a Roman citizen. And again, I come back to this text in Acts 25. I think it's so paramount. I think it's one of the reasons why Paul writes in the manner that he does in Romans 13, because Paul has lived this out in his own life. He knows the law, but he also knows the Christian's place in the working of the law. The Christian's place in the working of the law is not always and simply for the benefit of the Christian, but the Christian's place in the working of the law is to see how the gospel can be advanced. Paul does not relent from his citizenship as a Roman, nor does he sacrifice his citizenship rights as a Roman simply because he's a Christian. He avails himself of those things because he knows it can advance the gospel. Therefore, Paul says, I appeal to Caesar. Now, there were two forms of appeal to Caesar. One form was, I want to go and see Caesar himself. The other form was, I want to go and stand before the trials, if you will, or the due process in dealing with Caesar in Rome. It's unclear, really, ultimately, Paul will go and stand before Caesar himself, but it's exactly what Paul was within his right to request. Then when Festus had conferred with his council, he answered, you've appealed to Caesar you shall go. Remember that Paul was given this promise, you will testify for me in Rome, just as you testified for me in Jerusalem. So all of these events are lining up, and they're lining up in a very beautiful way to get Paul to Rome. And it's all part of the process. It's all part of the divine providence of God. It's so fantastic when we see it unfolding. Within that setting, we come to Acts 25, verses 13 into Acts 26. I don't know that we'll get all the way into 26, but we'll do the best that we can. Let's notice some other figures in perspective here. We've seen a couple already, but we'll expand our knowledge of who's who among this passage. So in Acts 25, now when several days had elapsed, King Agrippa and Bernice arrived at Caesarea and paid their respects to Festus. While they were spending many days there, Festus laid Paul's case before the king, saying, there is a man who was left as a prisoner by Felix. And when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews brought charges against him, asking for a sentence of condemnation against him. I answered them that it is not the custom of the Romans to hand over any man before the accused meets his accusers face to face, and has an opportunity to make his defense against the charges. So after they had assembled here, I did not delay, but on the next day took my seat on the tribunal and ordered the man to be brought before me. When the accusers stood up, they began bringing charges against him, not of such crimes as I was expecting, but they simply had some points of disagreement with him about their own religion and about a dead man, Jesus, whom Paul asserted to be alive. In other words, what does Festus have to say about these charges? I really don't see what the problem is what Festus is saying. I fail to see what they're all upset about. They had some religious disputes. He keeps rattling on about some guy named Jesus who was dead and now he claims is alive. And I don't really know what the problem is. I'm at a loss. Being at a loss how to investigate such matters, I asked whether he was willing to go to Jerusalem and there stand trial on these matters. But when Paul appealed to be held in custody for the emperor's decision, I ordered him to be kept in custody until I send him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said to Festus, I also would like to hear the man myself. Tomorrow, he said, you shall hear him. Now, let's think about who's in play here. So, in the passage, we're introduced to King Agrippa. So, Agrippa II and Bernice are brother and sister. Isn't that a great way to start a Bible class? Here's some info for you. Agrippa II and Bernice, his wife, are brother and sister. Also, these two, Agrippa and Bernice, are a sibling, or are siblings, to Drusilla, remember, the wife of Felix. He was about, that is to say, Agrippa, 17 when his father died. He ruled the northern part of Israel during about 52 to 70 BC. His AD. His headquarters were in Caesarea Philippi. He was the last Jewish king in the land, and Agrippa II was given oversight of the temple and oversight of appointing the high priest. The value here to Festus is that Agrippa knows the Jewish religion. That's why he's so intrigued by this matter. It just so happens that they're passing through the region. They stop and they go in to visit Festus. Festus says, by the way, some guy by the name of Paul was left here by Felix, tells him a summary of his case and his trial, and immediately Agrippa is fascinated. I want to meet him. I want to know about him. Well, go a little further. There's Drusilla. So Drusilla was the great-granddaughter of Herod the Great. Now, Herod the Great was responsible, Matthew 2:16, for sending out the death of all male children born at the time of Jesus in order that the threat of a king might be eliminated. Furthermore, Drusilla was the great niece of Herod Antipas. Herod Antipas was responsible for the beheading of none other than John the Baptizer. Drusilla was the daughter of Agrippa I. And then Felix seduces Drusilla away from the king of what would be known as Emesa, but what we understand to be ancient Syria. What a fun family to be around. When you think about scandal, I cannot think of a family that is both more enmeshed and just absolutely twisted than the family that is involved and engaged here between the Herods and their spouses and among their own family. You think about the nature of all of this. Furthermore, you see coming from this family even into their associates and relationships, you see those who would ultimately be responsible for raising up the current Nero, who is, or the current Caesar rather, Nero, who is in charge of Rome. It is an absolute Peyton's place. I mean, it's just horrendous when you stop and think about all of the enmeshment and all of the incest and all of the absolute malicious, envious, contemptuous, violent attitude that exists among this family. If you want to stop and think about the nature of what's going on here, I'm not familiar with a Hollywood script that can even come close to rivaling what you read here in the text of Scripture by the nature of these relationships. It's really quite devastating. Well, you've got Bernice. So Bernice marries her uncle at the age of 13, and then he dies. She then commits incest with Agrippa II. Agrippa II persuaded Ptolemy, king of Cilicia, to marry Bernice in order to stop the rumors. Stop what rumors? Stop the rumors that he and Bernice were hooking up. He needed to stop those rumors. Well, the marriage didn't last, so guess what? They just openly come out. The marriage, that is, between Ptolemy does not last with Bernice. So Agrippa II and Bernice just come out as married. She would later go on to be a mistress of Vespasian and Titus, not the Titus that we know of in the New Testament. It was an absolute debauchery that was carrying on. Friends, trust me, when Solomon's word was spoken, it still rings true today. There is nothing new under the sun. We cannot invent new ways. We might invent new packaging of the same old sins, but we cannot invent anything new. There's nothing new under the sun. Well, come back to the text. So those are your players, if you will, no pun intended. Those are the folks in the midst of the scene that is unfolding before our eyes. Acts 25. So on the next day, when Agrippa came together with Bernice amid great pomp, and entered the auditorium accompanied by the commanders and the prominent men of the city at the command of Festus, Paul was brought in. Festus said, King Agrippa, and all you gentlemen here present with us, You see this man about whom all the people of the Jews appealed to me, both at Jerusalem and here, loudly declaring that he ought not to live any longer. But I found that he had committed nothing worthy of death, and since he himself appealed to the emperor, I decided to send him. Yet I have nothing definite about him to write to my Lord. I still don't know why this man is in trouble, and I still don't know why he's appealing to Caesar. But I just know what he's done, and he has the right to do it. Therefore, I've brought him here before you all, and especially before you, King Agrippa, that after the investigation has taken place, I may have something to write. For it seems absurd to me in sending a prisoner not to indicate also the charges against him. Agrippa said to Paul, "You are permitted to speak for yourself." Then Paul stretched out his hand and proceeded to make his defense. A couple of things. Number one, when Festus hears this matter and he's encouraged by the Jews to take him back to Jerusalem, and then he comes before Paul and he listens to what Paul has to say, and Festus is scratching his head wondering why this guy's in prison in the first place. What offer does he make to Paul? Essentially, what do you want to do, Paul? How many times, you may not have been in too many courtrooms aside from our resident attorneys among our number. The rest of us may not have appeared in too many courtrooms. But with your knowledge and awareness of courtroom proceedings, how often does the judge ask those on trial, what do you want to do next? Do you see that happening a lot? I mean, I'm not an attorney. I stayed in the Holiday Inn Express once, but I'm not an attorney. I don't see that happening a lot. Larry, do you see that happening a lot? Leland, you see that happening a lot? I mean, is Richard with us? You don't see that happening a lot. Here again, it's just this other indication, I think, of Paul's status and folks asking, what do we do? Now, once more, he's standing before yet another official. And he's given an open rein of offer your defense. And so Paul offers his defense. What does he say? Well, Acts 26. In regard to all the things of which I am accused by the Jews, I consider myself fortunate, King Agrippa, that I am about to make my defense before you today, especially because you are an expert in all customs and questions among the Jews. Therefore, I beg you to listen to me patiently. So, within the nature of this passage unfolding, remember, Paul has always been a man on a mission, and he's obeying the call to witness to Jesus Christ, or witness of Jesus Christ to the Jews, to the Gentiles, and to the kings. Remember that calling in Acts chapter 9? He must be my witness, the Lord said, to the Jews, to the Gentiles, and to the kings. So, here's what he begins to witness. He speaks about a conflict with Christianity. He speaks about his conversion and his calling. And then he speaks about his commitment to the call. Paul simply begins to tell his story. This is how it started with me. So, while Paul was saying this in his defense, Festus said in a loud voice, Paul, you are out of your mind. Your great learning is driving you mad. But Paul said, I am not out of my mind, most excellent Festus, but I utter words of sober truth. For the king knows about these matters, and I speak to him also with confidence, since I am persuaded that none of these things escape his notice. For this has not been done in a corner. What has not been done in a corner? The fact that Paul says, it all started with me persecuting the church with great zeal. It continued with me seeking letters to go to different cities to persecute the church. And then on my way to persecute the church, I was struck with blindness on the road. Having seen the Lord appear to me, he calls, and I answer. And then he instructs me to go into the city where I am already headed to bind Christians and take them to prison. And he instructs me to go meet a man by the name of Ananias. And when I meet a man by the name of Ananias, He simply says to me, Paul, why are you waiting? Why tarriest thou? Arise and be baptized and wash away your sins, fulfilling what? The act of calling on the name of the Lord. When Festus hears all of this, rather, when Agrippa hears all of this, he says, you are out of your mind. When Festus hears this spoken by Paul, you've lost your mind. You've just absolutely lost your mind. I think it's part of the perplexity, too, that Festus is wrestling with and struggling with. He's still not connecting the dots. Why are people upset about this? I don't see what the big deal is. Jesus seemed to mention something about pearls and swine. Do you remember that? Do you remember that? Don't cast your pearls before swine. I don't know if any of you have ever struggled trying to understand what that means, like I struggle to understand what that means, but if ever you want to know what does that look like, I think this is one of those passages, Acts 24, 25, into 26. I think that's one of those passages that helps us understand that. Here Paul is explaining something in front of individuals. Some will get it, but others, key individuals, won't. They just don't get it. It just doesn't resonate with them. And they fail to see what the big deal is. But Paul also says this, none of these things happened in isolation. None of this happened in a corner. I mean, none of this happened in secret. These things are known, and they're known before others. In fact, these things are very well known. It was just one of those moments I think is so very sobering in Paul's life. So you think about the nature of what's happening here. It continues on. Agrippa has some things to say. King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? Why would Paul say, I know that you do? If you think about Agrippa's history, Agrippa's not unfamiliar with this group of individuals. He's essentially on his third generation now of dealing with the Jews in his line or in his family, of generation after generation after generation of seeing their work unfold. Agrippa replied to Paul, in a short time, you will persuade me to become a Christian. Some translations state that in the sense of Agrippa almost asking a question, do you expect to persuade me to become a Christian in such a short time? Other translations say, you almost persuade me to become a Christian. You almost get me there. You almost have me, Paul. Look at what Paul's response. I believe, in fact, it's the latter that Agrippa is saying because Paul's response seems to indicate it. I wish to God that whether in a short time or a long time, not only you, but also all who hear me this day might become such as I am, except for these chains. Paul was a child of God, and it's exactly what he wanted for his audience and Agrippa. Festus didn't get it. Paul, you've lost your mind. Agrippa, there's something different about how he's listening. Then the king stood up, and the governor and Bernice and those who were sitting with them, and when they had gone aside, they began talking to one another, saying, this man is not doing anything worthy of death or imprisonment. And Agrippa said to Festus, this man might have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar. Well, was it Paul's destiny to be set free? The Lord said, just like you testified for me in Jerusalem, so you must also witness for me, testify for me in Rome. It wasn't his destiny. It wasn't his purpose to be set free. And so it's noble. I really believe it's noble. I think it's sincere what Agrippa says to Festus. It really is. But even Agrippa doesn't see the bigger picture, can't see the bigger picture. Almost, I love that, you almost persuade me to become a Christian. Someone once said this, almost counts in horseshoes and hand grenades, right? We almost had a ringer. Who's ever got the closest horseshoe to the pole? Yes, they're the winner. If the grenade almost goes off, is that not a win? That's a win for everybody, yes? If the grenade almost explodes, that's a big win for a lot of people. So almost counts in horseshoes and hand grenades, but it doesn't count for eternity. It doesn't count for Agrippa's sake. It's really quite sobering when you stop and think about what Agrippa is speaking here to Paul. Almost winning is losing, almost passing is failing, almost believing is unbelieving, almost obeying is not obeying, almost being saved is lost. It is quite sobering when you stop and think about it. That almost, I don't know that we sing the song often, but we've sung the song before, almost persuaded. Almost persuaded. The power of that thought, almost there. It is really quite astounding. Questions, thoughts, observations, comments, remarks, or conversation? Go, Miss Sandy. The question is, if the Lord hadn't wanted Paul to be in Rome, could they have let him go? You know, I think it was certainly possible, but Paul had already sort of initiated that legal transfer, if you will, that legal process. And so now it was as though he has already filed that appeal when he says, I appeal to Caesar. And as a result, we can't do anything differently because Caesar, that's right, Caesar might have done something contrary to what they would have decided. So, look, this man's innocent. We can let him go, but he's already appealed to Caesar. We can't stop that. I think that circumstance too, Miss Sandy, is such that Festus knows what kind of trouble he's in the precarious relationship that's in that region. And so I don't think he was willing to do anything that would have looked to be mismanaged in the eyes of Caesar. I think he's really walking a fine line. Yes, ma'am. Other conversation or questions or thoughts? Go for it, Don. Paul was not having any part of that. That's right. Absolutely. It stirs up an entire hornet's nest, and Festus is there to do the opposite. He's there to blow the smoke and calm all the hive down. Absolutely. Get him out of here, get him on to Rome, and he's in that process appealing there. Absolutely. Other thoughts or ideas? Well, he's making his trip to Rome, and so we'll see Paul coming out of dealing with Felix and Festus and Agrippa. I think chapters 24, 25, and 26 are really beautiful chapters through the lens of God's providence and care for His people. And so if ever you need that reassurance or encouragement in your own life, then mark some, I would say, some unique chapters. While you see these events unfolding and the trials and appearing before individuals, you cannot help but see God's hand just moving through every moment, preserving Paul, taking care of him. He's not keeping him free from any difficulty or harm altogether, but you see him preserved through all the difficulty and all the harm that he is facing. And you see how God is providing. I think it's very beautiful. And you still see that in his voyage to Rome as well, chapters 27 through 28. So, here's a summary of these verses. Chapter 27, we're setting sail. Chapter 27, verses 14 through 44, the perfect storm. We make it to Survivor Island in chapter 28, and then we'll finally reach Rome at the end of chapter 28, about verse 11. So here it is, chapter 27, verse 1. When it was decided that we should sail for Italy, they proceeded to deliver Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. And embarking in an Admiritian ship, which was about to sail to the regions along the coast of Asia, we put out to sea accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica. The next day we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul with consideration and allowed him to go to his friends and receive care. Here again, just exquisite privilege given to Paul in all of his dealings. I think not only is it God's provision, but I think it's a testimony to the character of Paul. Paul, in this regard, sort of reminds me like Joseph. Everywhere Joseph landed, he winds up running wherever he lands. He winds up running the Father's affairs, if you will. He winds up running the prison when he's thrown in prison. After having started running Potiphar's house, he then winds up running the prison. He then winds up going to Pharaoh, and he starts running Egypt. But everywhere he's going, he is garnering the favor. I think Paul is in the same regard. He's just given this high integrity of character, and people allow him these privileges. So they're putting out from Sidon. We're going to sail over, eventually make our way to Rome. But here it is, making our way across this region of the world in order to gain Paul his access to Rome. From there, we put out to sea and sailed under the shelter of Cyprus because the winds were contrary. When we had sailed through the sea along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we landed at Myra in Lycia. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy, and he put us aboard it. When we had sailed slowly for a good many days and with difficulty had arrived off Secundus, since the winds did not permit us to go further, we sailed under the shelter of Crete off Salome. With difficulty sailing past it, we came to a place called Fair Havens, near which was the city of Lasea. So there's the big blue arrow. They're in the region here of Fair Havens. They're sort of hovering, if you will, around the island of Crete, and they're making their layover, if you will, in that region and that area. When considerable time had passed and the voyage was now dangerous, since even the fast was already over, Paul began to admonish them and said to them, "Men, I perceive that the voyage will certainly be with damage and great loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives." Paul gives a word of warning. Paul says it's probably not a good idea that we leave and that we journey on. But the centurion was more persuaded by the pilot and the captain of the ship than by what was being said by Paul. I can't fault the centurion, okay? If I'm the centurion, I don't really know who Paul is. I just know he's not a captain of a ship, and I know he's not a sailing man. I know he's not a pilot. And so Paul's giving this warning. Now, what awaited Paul in Rome? Prison. What prisoner is eager that you know in your life to go to prison? It stands to reason that the prisoner who's given some extra privileges while they're on this lovely island would say, "How about we stay here a little longer?" Does that not make sense to you? If I'm the centurion, it makes sense to me. Yeah, Paul, I'd like to hang out here too if I were you, waiting to go to prison, but I'm just not buying it. I'm not buying it. The captain, the pilot, no, we're good. Because the harbor was not suitable for wintering, the majority reached a decision to put out to sea from there. If somehow they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete, facing southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there. When a moderate south wind came up, supposing that they had attained their purpose, they weighed anchor and began sailing along Crete, close inshore. So, they're sailing from Fair Havens, hoping to make it to Phoenix. They're staying close to the shore of Crete. They want to winter on the different portion of Crete, and this is their direction that they're traveling. But the centurion, being more persuaded, goes along with this route. They want to reach Phoenix, but then they believe the time is right. Now, here's the unique thing I find in all of this matter, and that is the detail with which Luke is recording this exchange. It's phenomenal how precise he is about when they're sailing, where they're sailing, and what their travel plan was to be. And Bryan's observation is, I think Luke is being that precise simply because he's getting ready to show just how phenomenal, when it all goes south, God is in the midst of providing and preserving all of His intent and His purpose. So here comes the perfect storm. Questions or thoughts before? Let's hit the storm. Are you ready for a storm? It's Winter Storm Enzo. Here it goes. All right. So They're preparing to leave Fair Havens, make their way to Phoenix. Before very long, they rush down. They are rushed down from the land. Is that a bell? Who rang that bell? Shame on them. A violent wind called Araquello. And when the ship was caught in it and could not face the wind, we gave way to it, just go with it, and let ourselves be driven along. Running under the shelter of a small island called Clauda, we were scarcely able to get the ship's boat under control. After they had hoisted it up, they used supporting cables in undergirding the ship, and fearing that they might run aground on the shallows of Syrtis, they let down the sea anchor. In this way, let themselves be driven along. The next day, as we were being violently storm-tossed, they began to jettison the cargo. And on the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. Since neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small storm was assailing us. What kind of storm was assailing them? A big storm. From then on, all hope of our being saved was gradually abandoned. Day after day after day after day. Two things to observe. We've heard the bell. We'll have to pause here. Two things to observe from this passage. Number one, sometimes in life, some storms will come your way. And the only thing you can do with the coming of that storm is to give way to it. Sometimes you might lose a lot of yourself pushing and fighting against the storm. In fact, you might lose more of yourself trying to resist the storm than when you simply give way to it and accept the fact that the storm is here and you can't cause the storm to cease. And then, the other observation is not that we give up hope, but that we realize perhaps our hope in the wrong thing is being placed, and our hope is better placed in the right thing. They were looking, perhaps, that their decisions of what to do in this moment could relieve them. Throw the tackle overboard. Folks at sea choose that all the time. Dad spent many a day on a shrimp boat down in the Gulf of formerly known as the Gulf of Mexico. I don't know when all that takes place. I'm just saying, Matagorda Bay is where Dad would go and do most of his shrimping, so I don't know that there's a name change coming for that. So Matagorda Bay was where he would spend a lot of his shrimping days. And Dad would say that the swells that would arise at any one given moment in time were significant, and they were spontaneous, and they were quick. And if it got bad, you started jettisoning, lightening the load. If you will, sometimes our prescription of what we need to do in a storm is not the prescription we need to follow. And what you'll see next in Acts 27 is the prescription that God says, here's what we need to do to weather and to survive this storm. You all are so beautiful. You're so fantastic. We love you for every good thing that you offer and provide to God's people. You are making such an influence in the lives of many. Thank you for being who you are. Drew Slatton has waited all day. He braved the snow and the ice and the bitter cold temperatures to get here for announcements. Drew, it's all yours, my friend.
My own? Yes. I just have a couple of things. There's a men's night out next Thursday. There's a sign-up sheet. Just want to throw that out there. One thing to add to the prayer list, Linda Bell Lopez's sister-in-law, Robin Kidwell, has been diagnosed with, and I can't say this right, myasthenia gravis. It attacks muscles and nerves, whatever this thing is that I can't pronounce. So just add her to the prayer list, please, Robin Kidwell. And just want to make note, Pam Long and Linnell Ali are both going in for surgery tomorrow, so keep them in your prayers. I don't know of any other pressing announcements, unless anyone else knows of any. Okay, let's pray. Blessed are you, Lord, for this time that we have together. Thank you for the words that Luke wrote in Acts, that we see your guiding hand in Paul's life, and that it can tell us that if we will pay attention and follow you. Your guiding hand will be in our life too, through storms, through trials, through injustices, that we can remember that you are going through those with us. You are holding our hand. You are holding us up. Help us to depend on you and not on ourselves. Help us to keep our minds focused on your will and your goals. Forgive us of our sins. Forgive us when we are selfish. Forgive us when we forget those things. Forgive us when we put ourselves instead in front of others. Help us to be your love to the world around us. Help us to be your hands and feet in the doing of your will and the spreading of the gospel. Go with us, get us safely home this evening, and continue to watch over us, keep us close to you. It's in Jesus' name we pray all these things. Amen.